Hi everyone, welcome back students to a really interesting set of presentations. This is one of my favourite topics of this course. I want to be thinking about gender questions in today's videos. I've got 4 videos. I think pretty much each one has links to other fascinating video material. I found some wonderful exercises in the various textbooks to share with you today. As always, the format is clear. Watch this. Ideally with a partner on the telephone, you'll be having frequent opportunities to pause and discuss the questions. So thinking about feminism, women's studies and gender studies. Let's jump in with some definitions with the terminology itself. An area of study that may be expressed using these different terms. Or are they different terms? Think about these words for a moment. What do these words mean? You know, what are gender studies? What are women's studies? What is feminism or feminisms? Think about these words. What do they mean? Are they describing the same thing? Are these words synonyms? Or are they different? Think about it. Discuss with your partner. Pause here. Unpause. Yeah, what did you come up with? I'm guessing we are seeing some synonyms here. I think it's fair to say that if you take women's studies and you add the discipline of critical men's studies, I think those two together overlap very, very much with gender studies. Those are, for me, clearly almost synonyms. So women's studies, if we add critical men's studies, that is more or less the same as what we call gender studies. The term studies suggests that people are thinking about this and researching this topic. So these are areas where people are doing research. In other words, I think you can describe these as an academic discipline. And I'm sure if you search, you'll find bachelor's programs in gender studies or women's studies today. Good. The third term I have there, feminism, and I've given a variant with the S, obviously overlaps quite a lot with gender studies and women's studies. Many feminists will be drawing on the same literature as gender studies and women's studies authors also draw from. We should, however, notice a difference. Feminism also has the kind of status as being something we can research, a kind of academic discipline. It also has a separate meaning. When we think about feminism, we think of it as being a kind of social movement. It's a kind of protest movement. It's about political activism. It's about political campaigning, isn't it? So there's a little bit of overlap in terms of the theoretical aspect, but we notice that feminism really is about campaigning, about political change. So it seems to be something more than the other two. Good. It goes without saying, if you have an interest in any one of these terms, you tend to automatically have an interest in the other two as well. Let's move on. I've promised you some interesting exercises this week, and this is the first. What makes us men? What makes us women? Are you a woman? How do you know? How can you be so sure? Are you a man? How do you know? How can you be so sure? And it's a cracking book by Roman and Jackson, which is packed with similar exercises to stimulate your thoughts here. So once again, discuss this with your partner on the telephone, pausing here. What did you come up with? My students typically give me slightly tentative answers. You know, I think I am. The answer, how do you know, is normally answered with respect to biology. So my students might say, yeah, thinking about my body, thinking about my genitals. This is a strange spring, isn't it? Spring 2020. I'm recording a YouTube video and gesturing vaguely to my genitals. I didn't think I would ever be doing this on YouTube. Sorry, guys. But seriously, the point is valid. We do think of organic biological reasons really as the basic answer to the question. Other answers my students might give me, isn't it fascinating how when a baby is born, back when I was a kid, we didn't always know the sex of a baby before it was born. And when a baby was born, the sex would be a surprise to the parents, and the doctor would say, it's a boy or it's a girl. So it's quite fascinating that this maleness or femaleness might be labelled on you, the first thing to be labelled onto you in your biography, in your life. You know, it's the first sentence said about you a few seconds after you're born. Good. So our answers here might be centered around biology, and this seems to be a natural starting place in our considerations. I'm going to provoke you a little bit now. I'm going to ask a question rather rather provocatively formulated. In a sense, I'm going to be playing the devil's advocate. Think of me as being a little devil with little black horns on my head. If I play the devil's advocate, I'm going to propose an idea or make a suggestion which is not really my private thought. Okay, so if I make a comment in a discussion, maybe to get the discussion moving forwards, but the point I'm making is not really my own opinion. I'm playing the devil's advocate. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate here with you. Let's be provocative. There is a biological difference between men and women. Women can give birth, for example, men can't, that kind of thing. So there are biological differences thinking about genitals and stuff. Doesn't this explain the real difference between men and women, who are clearly not the same? As an example, hey, aren't men better at some things like fighting wars, for example? Men are cracking soldiers, isn't that a male thing? Women are better at other things, nursing in hospitals, for example. So aren't they different? And isn't this difference in their, for example, choice of profession, isn't that because of their biological differences? Once again, pause here and natter with your partner. What conclusions did you draw? I mean, we do notice, especially in a country like Germany, Germany has an amazing amount of occupational segregation. If, for example, a man says to you, I'm a school teacher, you can bet it's in one of these gymnasium schools. And if a woman says, I'm a school teacher, you really don't know. It may well be a primary school, very female environments. Although a primary school may have a male headmaster. Isn't that weird? Germany is amazingly gendered at the workplace. In fact, if you're interested, check out the international statistics there. Germany today is still more gendered than you might think. When I came to Germany 20 years ago, it was amazingly striking. We're moving forwards, mind. So we notice the gendered workplace, and we're asking ourselves, is there a direct cause and effect here? Is it simply only because of the biology? And the obvious answer is it could be, but on the other hand, society itself may be playing a role here. So that's what we're investigating in this course. And of course, the title of this particular module, Contemporary Social Issues, suggests that I'm interested in looking at this in the context of society. So that's what we're going to do in the next 4 videos. The idea I've just promoted, the idea that maybe men are by birth innately different from women, by birth innately, that idea can be summarized with the terminology of essentialism. What is gender essentialism? Gender essentialism is a theory which suggests that femininity or masculinity is innate. It's present at birth. It's somehow in the essence of our being. Examples, thinking that men are innately better at mammoth hunting, thinking that women are innately better at child raising. These ideas are essentialist thinking. My next question for you to natter about with your partner, 2 questions actually. What are the consequences of holding essentialist views? Fantasy, I'm a bit of an essentialist, I believe these things. What consequences does this belief have if we have this belief? So that's question 1. Question 2, what about you yourself? Are you an essentialist? Are you buying this argument? Do you instinctively have these essentialist views yourself? There you are, 2 questions to discuss. Pause here. The answer to the first question is quite clear. When we have essentialist views, we believe that men and women are innately different, and that makes us expect natural differences in their behavior. And if we believe in these natural differences in behavior, we might think that behavior is hard to change. Let me give a concrete example here. Let's say I'm an early education practitioner. I'm working in a nursery school. I've got two 4-year-old boys in front of me, and they're having a fight, and the fight is actually getting a bit aggressive. You know, they're really bashing each other or pulling at each other. The fight is becoming physical. And if I have these essentialist views, I might say, they're fighting, that's not great, but boys will be boys. You know, it's almost as if I'm expecting a bit of physicality from them from time to time. Yes, I will react and break it up, but in a sense, I'm seeing it as being part of their maleness, okay? So this is a concrete example. If I have these essentialist views, I might put down behavior to maleness or femaleness and not try to change it because I'm pessimistic about trying to change it. Good, so a fascinating consequence there. It's worth noting some essentialist views may seem very old-fashioned and very conservative. I was born in Britain, and British Victorian society is a fascinating example of a place where almost everybody had these essentialist views. Victorian gentlemen couldn't believe for a minute that women might be the same as them. They assumed that women were innately different and therefore should have different rights and different biographies and so on. Now, as somebody who was born in Britain, I'm not very, very dazzled with Britain's Victorian past. You know, it's not a period of the history that I particularly celebrate. I see it as being quite a problematic part of history. So I myself may want to distance myself from these very Victorian views on gender. You know, obviously I'm not thinking about gender like those Victorian gentlemen did. On the other hand, I may in moments find myself slipping into essentialist thinking. And it's worth noting some essentialist views, although possibly conservative, they can be reconciled, brought together with feminism. And a classic example of this is if a feminist wants to draw attention to female strengths. You know, is there such a thing as female strengths? And I can tell you maybe a nice anecdote to illustrate this. One of the loveliest of conferences that I've ever been invited to attend was a conference a couple of years back in England, a conference of midwives. Midwives are these wonderful people that help babies get born. They help deliver the baby, usually working together with a doctor, but often they can do it very well on their own. And it's an utterly fascinating profession because it is so female. There's very, very few male midwives. I'm not even sure what the word is for a male midwife. So I was at this conference. There's only 2 or 3 men, including myself. And I was having a privileged insight into female academic communication patterns. Normally, I see mixed academic patterns, but academic communication at conferences is quite dominated by male communication behaviors. For example, typically at conferences, you'll be hearing men make comments, and the comment is formally a question, but actually the question isn't a real question. It's simply to prove how clever the questioner is. You know, if you've been at a conference, you'll know exactly what I mean. And you might say, oh, Magnus, you're being very, very sexist there, suggesting that's a male thing. But this idea of mansplaining, you know, and there was none of that at this conference. There was a beautiful interaction in terms of people making contributions, people listening to each other. And I found myself almost having this essentialist idea. I thought to myself, wow, you know, women are better at these rich conversations involving listening, involving equal level exchange. Nobody's promoting myself here. Nobody's promoting themselves here today, I thought to myself. So there you are. It's an anecdote illustrating how, even if you think you don't have these essentialist views, you might be more on the fence than you think. There you are, female strengths. Let's move on. Hey, these are terms I should have actually defined a few minutes ago. In a sense, I should have started with this important terminology. Classic question this. Thinking about biology leads us to some important terminology in gender studies. Now, basic terms, what's the difference between sex and gender? I'm guessing you've already discussed this in other courses. Pause here, natter with your phone partner. Sex and gender. The difference normally is characterized as such. Sex refers to the biological characteristics of male or female, having, for example, certain reproductive organs. Gender refers to the way in which people of each sex fill certain social roles in society. So the one is largely biological, sex is largely biological, the other, gender, is largely social. Indeed, the gender concept, using the term gender, it helps us to think about how such roles, our social roles in society, how they may be socially constructed, created in society itself. It's worth noting this term gender, used in this way, is really, really new. It's so well established today. We use this word so much at the university today. It's worth reminding ourselves this is amazingly new. It goes back only to the kind of 1970s as being a term used a lot. Isn't that fascinating? So a term so essential to describe so many everyday ideas at the university, it's actually quite a new concept. Fascinating, huh? Good, good. Let's move on. Again, definitions. Let's move on now to this fascinating word feminism. And I've already used the plural feminisms. Together with your partner, think about what the word feminism, or its translation in your own language, Germans say feminismus, what it means to you. What does the word mean to you? How would you define it? What associations does it have to you? It's a word with fascinating nuances of meaning. Try and pin down some of those nuances of meaning. Yeah. Pause here, have a natter. Unpause. What did you come up with? I'm guessing your perspectives had some commonalities, but you might have also found differences. Indeed, if you speak a different mother tongue, you might have found more differences than if you speak the same mother tongue. The word feminism really is quite different in different places. In this particular set of talks, I'm going to focus on feminism in English and French-speaking countries. I'm not going to give German examples of German discourses, but it's a fascinating opportunity for you to compare. The word has many nuances of meaning. Beware, translating the word into your own language may not translate all the nuances of meaning. And I can illustrate this with an example. I was translating social work terminology, and in Britain we often talk about feminist social work. Feminist social work. It's social work thinking about all of those gender questions whilst I'm in my practice. And I thought to myself, how do you say that in German? I did, by looking it up in my favorite search engine, I did find something like feministische soziale Arbeit, but there were hardly any hits. In practice, few people were saying that. And I asked friends of mine, how could we say this in German? What's an equivalent German discourse? I think in German, you would simply talk about social work and gender together. And those social work and gender discussions, those discourses would be the equivalent of the British feminist social work discourse. So the word is not quite translatable in many situations. We can, however, pin it down. And certainly in English and French, we can categorize feminism. Interestingly, we can pin down three quite different forms of feminism, okay? Three different forms in total, and they're distinct enough for us to be able to separate them. Good, so we can create a typology of three different types of feminism. What we can also do is look at how feminism has progressed historically. We can look at the history of feminism, and here we note that feminism as a movement was more active in certain historical periods. And these periods are separated by periods of inactivity in terms of the social movement. So that's fascinating. If we look at the history, we find we can break down feminism into three distinct waves. Okay, so we had a first wave, a second wave, and then a third wave. Think of waves in the sea. Okay, now please note I'm confusing you here. In each case I've used the number 3, but the different types of feminism are not necessarily the same as the different waves of feminism. Okay, so this is a really, really important point. The different types of feminism do not have a one-to-one correspondence to the different waves of feminism. They're two completely separate ways of separating feminisms into threes, so to say. So be careful not to confuse these two concepts. I'm going to look at the different forms, different types first, and then afterwards I'll talk about the different waves, starting obviously in a minute with the first wave. But forget about the waves for now. First of all, the different forms. In the literature, we tend to identify three particular different types of feminism. One type we call liberal feminism, achieving economic and political equality within our democratic capitalist system. So typically feminist social workers will be doing this, thinking about our society today, just trying to make sure that women's rights are better protected, just trying to make sure that women's rights really are complete and comprehensive. That's our first type of feminism. In contrast to that, some people may say that they are socialist or Marxist feminists. Now, Marxism is characterized by this interest in conflict. Marx was looking at the conflict between different groups of people in society. Most famously, Marx drew our attention to the conflict between the workers and the factory owners, the workers and the capitalists, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. These parts of society were in a direct conflict. And here we have a very, very similar idea. Men and women are in conflict. Men are one group of people in society trying to push down, oppress the other group in society, women. Men are exploiting women. And this conflict is all part of capitalism itself. So a fascinating variant of feminism, we can talk about socialist or Marxist feminism. Good. The third variant of feminism, radical feminism we call it. This is quite interesting. It often has a separation-based agenda, enabling women to fulfill their potentials in man-free spaces. We had a discourse in England a couple of years back. An English politician noted some women don't feel comfortable in train carriages at some times of day. Could we have on particular trains a man-free carriage, a carriage for use by women only, so that women can feel more comfortable, particularly if the carriage gets empty? Interesting idea that the politician suggested. There's quite fascinating pros and cons of that. That itself is something that you can discuss with your partner if you like. Yeah, how do you find the idea of man-free spaces? And also, how do you find these different types of feminism? Pause here and ask yourself that. Let's move on. So we've now talked about the different types of feminism. I want to stop here though, and now move on to the history of feminism. This presentation is coming to a close, but I want to spend the last couple of slides looking at first wave feminism. Oh, isn't that a beautiful picture? I have to say, I do love Wikipedia as a wonderful corpus of public domain images. Isn't that beautiful? They are Japanese woodcuts, I think. 3 waves of feminism. Let's look at the first wave of feminism. When was this, historically speaking, really getting momentum in the mid-19th century? I mentioned Victorians just now. Yeah, see this as being a kind of Victorian movement. I think Queen Victoria, was it 1838 when she became queen? I've got a vague idea, it might be. Something like that, the mid-19th century. When did it last? Until the 1920s. And it lasted until the 1920s because some of the goals of that movement had been reached by the 1920s, particularly in countries like Britain. Good. We're talking about the first organised campaigns for women's rights through legislation, okay? So this is about activism, this is about people campaigning, people sensitizing the population to questions of women's rights. In particular, what concrete rights were women after? We can list them: equal access to education, to schooling, to university education, access to the professions, becoming a doctor, becoming a lawyer, that kind of thing. Rights to property ownership. Women should be able to own property just like men can. Rights in marriage. Okay, so basic questions. It's strange to think that these rights weren't in that society. My photo is really, really beautiful. You can read about this lady if you're interested. Fascinating biography, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. It goes without saying there's a history of doctors, there's a history of female doctors, but the medical profession became quite close to women because women weren't allowed to qualify as medical practitioners. And this lady was the first English woman doctor to fully qualify in that very masculine system, which actually had shut out women. So she's a fascinating early figure in modern British medicine. Well worth reading up about her life if you're interested. When Brits think about this first wave feminism, they're probably in their heads going back to their school lessons. I've forgotten almost all of the history I ever learned at school. 99% was utterly disinteresting, and it disappeared from my head shortly after the lesson. But it's fascinating how most Brits can remember learning about Emily Davison, the lady here in the picture. We can remember learning about her at school. This was one of our most memorable history lessons. I'm talking here about the suffrage movement. What on earth does that word suffrage mean? What is suffrage? Suffrage simply means the right to vote. So we're going back to a time just over 100 years ago when women did not have the right to vote. Men voted, women didn't. So there was lots of activism trying to reform this point, trying to reform this law. We separate the activists into two separate groups. We had suffragists and we had suffragettes. And what characterized their difference in principle was suffragettes were prepared to consider using violent protests. So they were considering more extreme means to make their point. The background, of course, for them considering this was that it was unclear whether peaceful demonstration was going to have any effect whatsoever. And the suffragettes would have argued we have to take more extreme steps. I'm going to lead you here to a video clip. There's the link here, but you can simply put in Andrew Marr, Emily Davison, Epsom 1913 to watch it. I think it's something like 4 or 5 minutes long. Andrew Marr tells this story. It's a story that Brits would have learnt at school. Indeed, the photos he shows or the video clip that we see there is something that I can remember from my own schooling days. Yeah, how did you feel when you watched this? How did you feel when you watched this? Watch the clip and discuss it with your partner. I'm going to come to a close here. Once again, a lovely literature tip. Try and get your hands on that lovely book. I'm going to steal another exercise from it in my next clip too. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Looking forward to the next one.